and some familiar too, which is always a bonus. So welcome to today's community meetup. Thank you to those in the room. I hope you've had enough to eat and managed to grab something to drink. Welcome also to our audience online. So we mustn't forget them. So I'm really pleased to be here as host. I'm standing into big shoes because unfortunately my colleague Callum is unable to be here today. And also one of our panelists, Alessandra Facio, is unable to come today. But that is not a problem. We've got two fabulous speakers tonight. So in terms of logistics, I'm your host for the evening. So all the logistical arrangements are up to me. If there's a fire drill, if you hear a fire alarm, then we'll exit out through the main door. So that's that bit over. So today's session is all about data and AI. March is Ethics Month in the community. So today we're going to be talking about ethics, data and AI, how data and AI technologies are omnipresent, threaded through every aspect of our life, and how, I'm just going to put my glasses on, and how we need to ensure that we develop a framework to ensure fairness, transparency, accountability and ethics. So we're going to cover a lot of different themes, including work being done in participatory AI auditing to assess the quality and potential harms of AI, as well as looking at responsible AI strategy, governance and monitoring. So the format for today is we have two presentations. I'll invite each of the speakers up to the stage. They'll speak for about 10 minutes. After the two presentations, we'll have a panel discussion, and then we will open up to the floor for questions. So if you've got any questions, keep them towards the end, and that goes for our online participants too. So this event is organised by the Data Lab community. I know that some of you aren't yet members of the community. And so we've included a QR code here. There are over 6,000 people in the community that has been going for the last 4 years. It's a very expanding and inclusive community of professionals, students, and anyone who has an interest or a desire to learn about data and AI. We run regular events like today's events. There's a wealth of webinars, information, opportunities to network and connect with your ecosystem. So I'd really advise you, if you're interested in learning more, to join up. We give support also. There's something that the students on the programme that I run love, and that is a jobs list that goes out once a week. So in fact, I should have started by saying I'm Marianne Dunbar. I've just realised I missed that out. I work at the Data Lab and I run the Data Lab Academy programme, which has supported more than 1,000 students through master's courses and into jobs in Scotland. So if you're, because we want to spread the word about what we do and the ecosystem, so if you're able to post about us on LinkedIn, please tag the Data Lab community. Of course, everything that we do relies on partnerships, and we have many Data Lab partners who support what we do, believe in what we do, and help us at various points. They certainly help the students that I look after in my master's programme. So that's setting the context. So I'd like to start now by inviting our first speaker, Leonardo Becerra, who's a lecturer in data and AI at Stirling, where we have, just to note, funded 240 students over the last 10 years through master's programmes. So please come and join us, Leonardo, and let us know how we've got from Brazil through Brussels to Stirling. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I usually have a few slides in the beginning to introduce myself, but because it was a bit shorter, I thought about not doing it. So I'll just speak a bit about that. I'm from Brazil. I'm from a town where maybe if you follow football, it's where Suarez beat Chiellini in the World Cup of 2014. Usually people understand it like that. I helped found a non-profit organization in arts and social work when I was there. And eventually I applied for a PhD fellowship in Belgium. And I went there to study. Originally I studied computer science, and in the PhD I was studying fundamental AI algorithms. So trying to see how algorithms could design algorithms, which now seems like a bad idea, but at the time it sounded nice. And I finished my PhD, I went back to Brazil to be a lecturer there, and I spent 7 years, had 2 daughters, and I decided to relocate now in 2023 to Sterling because I wanted to pursue this idea of discussing ethics and responsible and social impacts of AI. And now I'm here in Scotland. I think it shows a very good place to be. Thanks for being very welcoming and friendly. And it's everything that people speak about Scotland is actually really true, spot on. Here I'm representing the Phone project, which is the talk is supporting society to assess AI. It's many universities, as you can see here in the bottom. I will be more specific about this soon enough. But the idea is that we have in the world now regulation into AI. So the EU AI Act has just been approved by the European Union, and it's been implemented over the course of these and the following 2 years. And because of that, AI will have to be evaluated as to its risks. And it's actually revolving around the idea of fundamental rights. If the system, the AI system, incurs into a violation of the fundamental rights, then it's considered unacceptable, and then it cannot be deployed in the EU. So I'll give you one example. If it's a real-time government surveillance of citizens, or if there's some kind of scoring of people, then it's considered to be violating fundamental rights, and because of that, it cannot be deployed in the EU. There's another situation when the fundamental rights can be negatively affected, and these systems are considered to be high risk. So if they're high risk, it means they're going to have to be subject to several obligations and requirements. For instance, they might have to register with the EU, they have to be assessed throughout their life cycle, and that's where we kick in, because the UA Act, along with other regulatory frameworks that are emerging, will require society to be able to assess AI algorithms. And then the question is, do you trust this AI guy to represent society when assessing risks and harms? I am that AI guy. And I was surrounded by those AI guys for the longest of time, especially during my PhD. And we're very well-intentioned people, but for sure we don't have the full understanding of society or the multiplicity in perspectives that society requires, so that we're able to develop systems that are actually representing the interests of society. So the idea is that right now when assessments are done, they're typically done quite late in the life cycle. So after you deploy the system, you start assessing how it goes and eventual harms that it may cause. That is usually not the best approach. It would be better, let's say GDPR was able to promote this idea of data privacy by design. When you're designing the solution, the systems, you're trying to be already mindful of privacy. So it would be better to have an approach that is earlier in the development cycle. There is a lack of agreement on what counts as good enough to pass. For instance, in the US, one of their proposals was like, we take as reference an existing process, and then you would have to show that the AI system is either not worsening the outcomes of that manual process, or it is improving somehow. But you see that it's difficult to set this frame of reference to understand when the AI system is being beneficial or not. There are no standardized processes and tools for doing this assessment, so this is a very recent field in the sense of the technology changing very often. So for predictive AI, it's more easy to find solutions, but like generative AI became mainstream very recently, and because of that, everything that has been developed as a methodology to address it is even more recent. And then for us, what we're trying to tackle is end users or affected people who are like the target of the AI system are usually not involved in that assessment, because most of the times it requires some AI literacy or AI background so that you're able to take part in the assessment. So we are the PHONE project, which is participatory harm auditing workbenches and methodologies. So the idea of the acronym is probably to be original, but you can pronounce it as PHONE, so it sounds like actually foam. But we are 7 universities, academic institutions together. I have this map that tries to show how we are scattered across the UK. So it's quite a big project if you think about it. It's like 40 people together. And all these 7 universities mentioned here. So at the University of Edinburgh, in this case, it's the Data Lab, who's hosting us here tonight. Thank you for this. And the idea is that we're, if we had to like summarize in a sentence, we're trying to empower a diverse set of stakeholders without technical AI background to undertake audits of predictive and generative AI, both individually and collectively. And then each of these parts poses a problem in itself, right? The first is that to have a diverse set of people in society that have different backgrounds come together and assess an AI system, that is a challenge in itself. I can tell you I already worked in other projects that had more than 25 people coming from different backgrounds. And to get the terminology all set and to get everybody to speak the same language, it's very, very challenging, because something that is very trivial to me is very not trivial to somebody else, and vice versa. So this morning somebody was asking me about ethics, and I was saying, yes, let me explain you something. Like, my background is in AI, and there's another person whose background is in ethics. So probably your question is better suited to that person than to me. We're trying to bridge the gap between these different backgrounds, right? And then the idea of generative and predictive AI is because different technologies require very different kinds of assessment. But we are going to need tools that are, let's say, at least standardized enough that you're able to undertake the assessment in different application scenarios. And finally, this idea of individually and collectively, because if you ask a single person to do the audit, you have one challenge to address. But if you ask 5 people to do the audit, you have the 5 individual challenges to address, but the 6th challenge is how do you draw consensus from those 5 different individual audits, right? So this is what we're trying to address. We're tackling 4 different use cases. So there's health, media content, cultural heritage, and collaborative content creation. The first 2 are in predictive AI, the latter 2 in generative AI, and we are doing things in parallel. So right now we're doing health. We just did one with NHS on a system called Spara, and now we're doing a second one also in health. And in parallel in generative AI, we're doing cultural heritage. So we are working with the museums and the National Library of Scotland. I will show you later the partners specifically. So for use case 1, which is health, we're doing NHS Scotland and Public Health Scotland. The second one is going to start in the second semester of this year for predictive AI with Stella on media and content. We already started cultural heritage last year with the National Library of Scotland, Museum Data Service, and the David Livingstone Trust. And in collaborative content, which is going to start in the second semester, we have Wikimedia in different versions and also Full Fact. So these are the use case partners. We also have a lot of research partners. I'm now working more directly with Nokia Bell Labs, but there are also more partners that are going to eventually tag along for specific research that we're doing. And there are a lot of engagement and impact partners, bringing like the industry, government, civil society. So some of these names here are names that you're familiar with, and they're helping us in events like this, for instance, to promote this. We have an advisory board that is scattered around these parts of the world. So I tried to show a map to help you see it. We're actually still expanding it because we're also supposed to tackle Japan. So Fujitsu is already a partner in Japan. We're trying to add somebody in the advisory board from there. But although all the dots are in Western countries, like I'm from Brazil, one of the people based in Ireland is actually from Africa. So it's like we're in these, let's say, Western institutions, but we also have backgrounds that are not necessarily Western. And what are we trying to deliver? The workbenches and methodologies so that auditors without AI expertise can be auditors of that, be part of the auditing process that tackles both predictive and generative AI. And for me, one thing that is very important is these two later stages, which is to train society to perform the audits. So like the EU AI Act, the part that is already in place is the part that requires that any company that uses AI to provide AI literacy to its collaborators, right? If you're in a company and your company is using AI, you need to be trained to understand what AI is so that when you're using AI software, you know what it is supposed to do and what it is not supposed to do. AI is not a magic bullet, it's not a silver bullet. It has limitations, it has benefits, you need to understand how it goes. And last, we're trying to look into AI certification that organizations will be able to adopt. How are we doing this? Like the major thing is the participatory user research. So we are just doing this now, for instance, with NHS, we're using co-design with workshops with the general public, but also questionnaires with professionals in the health sector. And we had a focus group with the National Library of Scotland. So we're trying to understand what users think and society in general thinks so that we inform this process. And we have this idea of a multidisciplinary methodology. I'll give you one example. Whatever we are doing, you're trying to harmonize it with policy because anyway, let's say the best fit for auditing is in the context of making sure that something complies with regulation. One thing that was very concerning to stakeholders, to society in our user research was privacy. So I think our society, as a result of GDPR, has an awareness of data privacy and data-related issues. In the user research, we don't hear them speak so much about the models and how the models make decisions, but they are very aware that there is data involved and the data concerns that it involves, right? So I think this is one thing that is interesting. We are saying that GDPR had a positive effect in terms of this literacy regarding data. We are hoping that this is also going to happen with AI. And then the idea of consensus is only going to come through some kind of multi-criteria decision making because there's no way you have 5 people in the room and they're going to agree. There's just no chance. There has to be some compromise, and multi-criteria decision making is all about this. I'll give you one example to summarize, to wrap it up. Risks and harms are 2 terms that you might hear a lot when you're hearing about AI. But these terms are used with diverging definitions. You can find them used both in literature and policy in different contexts, like the EU AI Act says that a risk is the likelihood of a harm and the severity of that harm. If you read in other places, you find different definitions. And in use cases, we also see a variation. So in health, it's very easy for us to be talking about risks and harms, but in cultural heritage, they have a very different perception into that. So we were trying to find a way to approach this that would be more harmonized across these different scenarios. So we came up with a harmonized definition, which is just we take an event, that event has a likelihood, it has an impact, and then we are working on that. So when we're doing the participatory research on health, for instance, we asked the users to come up with the harms that they could envision associated with the system we were addressing, we were auditing, which was the SPARA system. And they came up with 7 different harms. Actually, they came up with 15, and when we were processing those 15 harms, they could be broadly categorized into 7 different harms. And then we asked them to do some prioritization between the likelihood and the impact. And based on that, we started addressing specific harms and thinking with them, how would you measure those harms? How would you address those harms? So it's basically 7 institutions with 40 people from different backgrounds. And what we're trying to do is use different knowledges to come up with approaches that are addressing the plurality that we have in society. So that's what I wanted to say very briefly. My kids asked me to do this, so you're welcome, and thank you. Victoria.
There we go. Thank you so much, Leonardo. Now I'd like to invite Victoria Kulig to the stage, so to speak. Victoria is a responsible AI manager at Accenture, and she's a former policy advisor at the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. So welcome, Victoria.
Thank you very much, and hi everyone. Lovely to be with you. My name is Victoria. I've been at Accenture for about a year now as a responsible AI manager, and I'll tell you a bit more about what that involves in a minute. But in terms of my broader background, prior to Accenture, I was also at a different consultancy, working a lot with public sector organizations on digital ethics, so a bit broader than just focused on AI, including with Scottish Government and working on the strategy for Scotland and thinking about what does it mean for Scotland to become an ethical digital nation. Prior to that, I was within policy space at UK Government as well, and academically, I'm kind of in between philosophy and computer science, which is a disastrous combination when you're trying to switch to computer science. But if I tell you a bit more about what I do and kind of how that relates to the topic of what I'll be talking about, I'm very glad that Leonardo went first, talking about assessing systems and bringing people together for that audit purposes. If I were to summarize what I do and the definition of how we look at responsible AI, we take those thousands of years of thinking about ethics, about social norms, about AI in its current state, and we try and pull it together into a 3-month project. As an example, my team in the past 3 months have reviewed about 250 systems. So it's thinking about how do we take what's best and turn it into something that we can scale without losing the core of what ethics and responsible AI are actually thinking about. And so if you think about the context, and again, I'll be reflective in a way, because I've given a lot of talks around what digital ethics is, in particular, in the past 5 years. But even 3 years ago, I had to really stand my ground and say, okay, why are we even talking about this? Is it important? Well, I don't need to tell you now that AI is booming, GenAI is booming. Everyone's actually kind of starting to awake to some of the challenges that it's posing and the potential consequences. Some of them blown out of proportion, AI coming to kill us all, but others very much realistic and impacting at us day to day. I'm really glad, actually, that GenAI has started that conversation and has started to point to some of the challenges that we have and the harms that we may come by if we don't rein in what we want out of our technology. And with that comes awareness, and that's, I guess, 2 strands of awareness. One is that societal level of understanding that AI is here, it's impacting us day to day, and we don't want this to do us harm. And again, if I think about the fact that my grandma is nearly 80, she lives in rural Poland, and she will now ask me questions about what does it mean? What are you doing in your job? Are you making sure that robots don't come for me? There is that level of understanding, but I think it's also started to permeate across organizations where in the past we may have had a few that would put forward a set of principles. They'll say, yeah, of course, we want our tech to do good, without putting that into practice. But now what we're seeing is real call to action. We're seeing organizations actually worried about, okay, I've got these principles, I've got this regulation. What is it that I actually need to do? How do I make sure that I'm true to my word and start doing something about it? And this is where we come on to ownership. And it's another very interesting shift, because up until about 3 years ago, we saw a few enthusiasts of the topic kind of starting to raise awareness in the organizations. There may have been people who have been working in the space, reading in the space, and just trying to kind of rally a crowd of people who would want to think about some of the responsible AI or ethics issues relating to that company's kind of digital strategy. But what we're seeing now is that actually a lot of stakeholders in a number of teams are owning up, wanting to introduce some specialism into their own teams to start thinking about, is the tech that we're putting out there the right tech? Is AI doing what we want it to be doing, or are we risking it going rogue? And not necessarily an end of the world sort of way, but maybe impacting individuals whose decisions about whom are made without the right guardrails in place. And the ownership point is also really important because depending on who brings the conversation in, we get quite a different exposure to some of the risks and harms. And again, that's the point that Leonardo was bringing up around, we'll gather stakeholders from different groups. They may not be speaking the same language. They may not be paying attention to the same problems. And we're seeing the same thing where sometimes the conversation about ethics and responsible AI comes from regulation. This is the conversation that I often undertake because we work a lot with compliance teams. And the fact that regulations kind of being accepted at the moment is really driving that strand. But maybe coming from risk and organizations being worried that they'll land themselves on the front page of newspapers because their AI tool has done something that they didn't want it to do. It could be coming from tech and the kind of willingness to improve some of the technology, looking at things like accuracy or fairness, just to make the tech better. Point being that it isn't that one's better than the other. All routes, to me, are good routes as long as we're talking about the subject. But ultimately, what we find is that this cannot work unless it's a very holistic approach and unless all the stakeholders are on board. And I'll get to that in a bit more detail in a minute. But because I mentioned regulation, and Leonardo also spoke about AI Act, which is the bane of my existence, but also something really, really good. Right? Regulation's a really important lever for us when we think about responsible AI. And while we may not agree on whether the act's great or not, ultimately what it did is unlocked a lot of budget for somebody to be looking at these problems, to start both kind of outside of the commercial space, but also with the organizations that I've been working with, who may have had those groups of enthusiasts in the past that kind of did it as side-of-desk activity. I want to be promoting some ideas, raising awareness. Now they've got regulatory deadlines to meet. They've got a set of requirements that they need to actually put in place. And that's very much a good thing, because it actually triggers action that is non-negotiable, because compliance department will count down other teams very hard. The challenge is that it can very much alienate a lot of people who work in the space. Regulation is always, well, not always, often put in opposition to innovation. And we're definitely seeing that unless you can take all people on the journey and unless you can make it easy for them to understand and show them the benefit of putting certain measures in place, you will lose them and you will not achieve the outcomes that you want. Now, the next point is around governance. And again, if I reflect back to 5 years ago, 3 years ago, when I was talking about digital ethics, my sole aim was to stay in people's mind long enough that next time they're working on a new tool or new decision-making, they will think about what they've heard and ask themselves a question about some of the unintended consequences that what they're doing may have. Now, I think that's not enough, because organizations have absolutely jumped on that GenAI bandwagon, and we're seeing kind of very little scrutiny in terms of some of the use cases that are being developed. So the point around governance is that we do want to put in systemic assessment in place. And again, to Leonardo's point, sorry, I keep on pointing at you, we've made a lot of really good points. We don't want it to happen too late, because sometimes the too late may mean that, well, we spend all this money, let's just put it out there. We want it to start at the idea stage. We want to know, okay, what are the likely consequences? Should we really be doing it? Is the AI even the right thing to do? I mean, I've seen GenAI used for really, really mundane things, and the question is, do we really need to be spending so much energy to be doing something that takes a second to do? So the governance is there to make sure that in a systemic way we're able to identify things at the right time, that we're able to actually track progress over time as well, and see the trends that may be emerging within the organization too. So say if we see that there's a lot of new AI tools being put, or the willingness to put a lot of AI tools out there, without thinking about how to be transparent about their use and explaining what is it that these tools do, that may point to an area of weakness within the organization that may need to be addressed kind of more holistically and broadly as we think about those responsible AI ambitions. Now, AI doesn't happen without the tech, and tech is important. Again, an observation that I have is that tech people get it. They're usually very keen to get on board, as long as you don't slow them down with the process. So I'm seeing a lot of very positive developments. We've got a lot of great techniques, particularly around bias and fairness measurements. I think these have advanced greatly. But again, it's how do you bring that into commercial context where by necessity you will be pushed to do things quickly. So how can you make it easy to raise some of these issues on a regular basis? And this is where the last point and the most important one comes in, and that's around culture and people. And I guess it's twofold. One is that you absolutely need to have people on board because you cannot put an efficient and effective responsible AI or ethics program without having people understanding where you're coming from and why you're doing this. But secondly, the culture of organizations can often be the blocker to doing this right. And to give you an example, I used to work with a bank, and we were working in data ethics space there. And we're trying to figure out why there were so many issues with data quality. And what we found out was that a lot of employees really wanted to make a good impression on their managers. I mean, who doesn't? But the way the performance was being measured and how it was being assessed was that there was this big dashboard of all data set owners and some stats around their data quality issues. Essentially, you started off with assumption that you're green and you're good. And if you raised an issue that you spotted that needed remediating, that would drop you down to amber or red, depending on severity of the issue. So immediately, you do not want to be showing that you've got an issue because you're flagging on that report as being amber or red. So people are not raising these problems just to fly under the radar of the manager. And thus the data quality remained lower than it could have been because there wasn't that culture of speaking up and actually doing something about it. So it wasn't any technical measures that we needed to put in place, but actually address some of the behavioral issues within the organization that helped. And it's becoming more and more important when we think about AI and responsible AI. And going back to the challenge of this being a holistic endeavor, ultimately we need to bring a lot of different people to the table. There will be those who understand the intricacies of the system and how it works from a technical point of view. And there'll be those who, from ethics side or compliance side, will be worried about some of these consequences. So how do we build an environment when everybody can share and is willing to collaborate to surface some of these issues? Particularly when, again, we do not have necessarily the luxury, and that is the sad part of it, I think. We don't have the luxury to examine a use case for 3 months. Often these need to go out and out and out and the new iteration every day just to keep up with the competition. So it's thinking about how do you make it quick without actually compromising on the quality of what you could be doing. So this is what I do. This is what responsible AI in commercial organizations looks like. Thank you very much. Very happy to answer questions later on. The QR code may work. I hope it does. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn. And thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I think, have I to sit on that one at the end?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Where? Oh. Leonardo.
I'm trying to add her only.
Oh. So thank you both for such insightful presentations coming from different points of this argument. So I'm going to start off, and first I'm going to start off with an admission that my colleague Callum wrote these questions, and Callum works with the Scottish AI Alliance and is therefore very, very informed on everything to do with data and ethics. So Leonardo, can I start with you? How can participatory, I can't say it, harm auditing help assess the risks and quality of AI systems? And what are the challenges of implementing such audits at scale?
So the first thing is, I'll give you an example. The MIT has this AI risk repository where they got these about 56 different taxonomies, and they combine all of them, so they have over 1,000 risks that are listed there. And when we did the first use cases with participatory research, some people were bringing up harms that were not listed in that 1,000 risk list. So it's just to say that when there's two ways of thinking about this. One is top-down. You're maybe in a company or in academia, and you're thinking about this, and you're trying to connect this to the harms and create a list of the harms. The other is the bottom-up, your society, and you're trying to just mention those harms. And there has to be a connection between these two approaches, where whatever was conceived in regulation, in academia, in industry, connects to whatever society really thinks. And then when you think about the challenges, and you're talking about scale, this is always the challenge that, so now I give access to, let's say, if I wanted to do that same exercise that we did with this room here, now I have so many people that processing all those harms into a subset of harms that we can address is challenging, because let's say that we give the option of free input of harms. So everybody's going to come up with a different definition, but in practice, maybe some of those definitions are the same. And if they are definitions that we already know of, then maybe we have suggestions on how to measure and address those. But if they are new, you have to think, how do I connect to existing approaches, or do I need new approaches for that? So I think the catch there is both the consensus and the on-the-fly aspect of it. So there are some works on this that try to connect. You just show me your system, and I try to tell you what are the harms involved there. And we're trying to use the taxonomies to say whatever harm you say, we try to connect to those taxonomies. But still, there's always going to be the parts where I try to tell people, like, oh, you're thinking that all of this can be measured objectively with a specific metric, but that might not be the case. And even for the ones you can measure objectively, you're thinking that there's like a threshold that you're going to set, and that's the acceptable bar. And if it goes lower or higher than that, then you raise a flag. But it's not that easy to take a metric and just set a bar. So I think this is where the challenge lies.
Thank you. So, Victoria, you touched on this a little bit, just about the push and pull, the speed of change, the speed that an organisation like Accenture is expected to work at. So how can professionals like you working in data and AI ethics navigate these challenges where business priorities might overshadow ethical considerations?
Yeah, that's a very big challenge, and I'm not sure if I necessarily have an answer to it. What I would say is that we need to just be clear about the fact that businesses are there to make money, and we kind of can't skip over that fact. And I think I definitely fail for being idealistic in the past, thinking I can just convince them that it's the right thing to do. That's not enough. But I think what we have seen is that you can frame the ethics conversation around the risks to the organization. Okay, we can push it out and risk reputational damage, or we can risk the regulator coming down at us because we haven't made sure that things are in place as they should be. Equally, there has been a lot of research around kind of more responsible AI-oriented teams when it comes to building AI products, and actually they tend to perform better when they take the responsible AI considerations on board. And for example, that could be about thinking on the accessibility of some of the solutions. Ultimately what you're doing is expanding your user base if you do bake that as default. So I would say, to balance the two, it's important to acknowledge that there will always be business drivers, there will always be budget that can be cut. So we just need to work within those constraints, but actually show how embedding a responsibility in ethics can help and support these ambitions too. So it's probably not an idealistic way to say, but I think that is the reality of it. To really make sure that it doesn't get skipped, you need to show the value of it.
Leonardo, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, so the way I see it, and that's what I usually try to tell people, is like, you're talking about the risks and the likelihood of the risks and how to mitigate those risks. And then you're talking about the associated harms and the impact of those harms. I think the only way that you get a business to adhere to this is when you say, this risk has this likelihood and it would cost this much to address it. But if you incur in the harm, let's say the liability that is associated with this harm will incur in this much. And then they look at both pictures and they think it's cheaper to address the risk than to wait for the harm to deal with the liability. this is the practical approach that I try to take, because in the end, it's very easy to convince a business when you have the numbers and you can show that. The challenge is, I've already worked with business that they would say, but we don't have the figures right. Like, it's difficult to make that calculation. So when it's difficult to make the calculation, it's a bit more challenging to convince. The other aspect is that many of the things that are happening right now are just motivated by FOMO, the fear of missing out. And unfortunately, that is a very known way where businesses are willing to lose money just because they don't want to fall behind, like you say, the competitive advantage. So they know they will be losing money, but they're still doing it. So these are the things we have to balance in this situation.
I would also add, I don't want to come across as very cynical about it. A lot of people care, and none of us want to do harm. It's just about how do we work effectively within those budgetary constraints to make it happen.
Yes, thank you. So a question for you, Leonardo. Are current AI regulations and ethical guidelines sufficient, or do we need stronger legislation to protect users? And what should governments do to balance innovation with oversight?
So one thing is regulations. Right now, in the Western world, I think the only one we can talk about in terms of hard law is the EU AI Act. Because the US had an executive order that was just revoked. It has a project that has been introduced in 2019, then reintroduced in 2022, then reintroduced in 2023. It just means it's not moving. California had a legislation passed and then vetoed. And the UK has decided to follow suit in the idea of soft law. So in terms of regulation, I think the only regulation we actually have in terms of hard law is the EU. Other countries are trying to follow suit, like Brazil just approved one. It's a two-tier house like we have here, and in the US as well. So one of the houses approved it. But now with the change in the political scenario, I'm not sure that the other house is going to follow suit and approve it as well. So last year I was sure it was going to be passed. It was like mirroring the EU AI Act. Now I'm not too sure. The second aspect is what you mentioned. So in terms of regulation, I think we are not there yet. In terms of the innovation versus regulation, I like to learn from history and from other industries. So the UK has just like brought up this question on creatives and the protection of their works. And this is very interesting because if you go back to the 50s in the US, the music industry had this regulation where you had rights over your song in terms of the recording of the song. Once you record the song, you have rights over that recording. But it didn't have rights over the arrangement, which is how you play the song. So if you recorded it in one way and somebody recorded it in a different way, there was no protection and it could be copied. And what this led to was that a lot of the music that was being created innovatively by the Black Americans, the African Americans, was being copied by white performers. And you have a situation where the lack of regulation was hurting innovation. Because what is your incentive to innovate if by the time you finish innovating, somebody's just going to come and copy it? Which is what the UK is discussing now for the artists. Why am I going to come up with a novel if it's just going to go into a model and then anybody else can make a copy of that novel in their own way, in those own words? So I think the idea of trying to oppose regulation and innovation is not necessarily correct. I think the issue that we don't want is that we don't want bureaucracy. We don't want to be stalled by bureaucracy. And I was in the public sector in Brazil. Bureaucracy is a nightmare. But this doesn't mean that regulation is opposed to innovation.
If I may just come on to that, I've heard a really good metaphor that I do use when people do bring up the challenge of innovation versus regulation. And that's around, if you're standing on a cliff, if you think about the barriers being there, you will come up to the barrier believing it will stop you, and you'll look over and enjoy the view. The barrier's not there, you will not come as close. You may not see the view because you just don't know if it's safe. And I do like to think about regulation kind of being partly in that way, or at least, again, in an ideal way, it would work in that way. I do believe that it's great that we've got regulation. It is triggering more action than that I think we would have seen otherwise. What we need is good regulation, and I think we will see if the one that we're grappling with at the moment will prove to be that. I think jury's still out. We're still a while away from some of the deadlines coming into play. And I think it is proving quite challenging because it is new. It's asking for things that we haven't necessarily been thinking about before. The fundamental rights when it comes to some of the AI solutions, it was very rare to, I think, address them at the scale at which they need to be addressed right now.
Just one comment on that. I learned from a company, so the same company that is the controller of Scottish Power here in the UK is the controller of a company called Neo Energia in Brazil. So it's all Iberdrola, this Spanish utility company. And I work with the innovation department in that company. And the guy would always say, the supervisor would always say, innovation is when you look at the analog process and you don't just make it digital. You think where it's right, where it's wrong, where it needs to be improved, and then you do that, and then you make it digital. Otherwise, you're just digitizing a process that is broken. So I think in that sense, regulation is, when Victoria says it's unlocking the budget, I think it's a great opportunity to say what regulation is doing is saying, look, this is the moment for innovation. We can do innovation in a way that is just reproducing or worsening what we already have in an analog society, or we can look into the future where this opportunity to go digital, to go at scale through AI, will make the world a better place. So that's what I try to convey as a message to students, to say it's going to be like you and me making those decisions in the long run when we are in a company, when you're in academia, wherever we are in civil society, but we are going to be faced with that question. And for me, it's like riding a bike. There's no point where you stop and you don't fall. You're either riding up or it's pushing you down. So I think we have to use this moment to ride up and improve it.
So working in a big organisation like Accenture, Victoria, perhaps you could let us know what strategies are effective in embedding ethics in decision making.
A big question again. So I think at Accenture, what I would say is there's two things. We've got our own internal program, and I really love that about what we do, is that responsible AI is there at the core. You don't push AI out without having done an initial assessment, and then if your AI product could be seen as potentially high risk, we do quite a lot of in-depth assessment. Everybody gets upskilled on responsible AI kind of on their day one. It's part of the mandatory training. So there's definitely that awareness. And our kind of tone from the top all the way from CEO down is, if we are looking to put AI or generative AI solutions with clients, we do need to make sure that responsible AI is embedded. So there's that very strong message that responsible AI is at the table whenever you're considering AI and responsible AI and generative AI. But I think we've had time to think about it. We've got big teams devoted to it. When I work with clients, it may be quite different. Like I said, it may be somebody who has recognized the problem and is trying to bring us on. And I think that journey to actually embed ethics considerations throughout the organization proves to be quite difficult. But I'd say two things. One is that tone from the top really, really helps to actually say, okay, as a company, we care about it. And I think most companies will have their own kind of proclaimed sets of values. It's really not that much further, just saying, okay, these values apply to the tech that we push out as well. So just trying to see that and reinforce that it's really important. And second, I think it really helps just to, again, frame it back as what is the risk if we don't? And I think the growth in responsible AI space is actually leading to that FOMO part as well, where a lot of brands are making it now part of their brand that they are responsible. Whether they really are or not is another question, but at least there is that kind of responsible AI has entered the chat. We're talking about it, we're bringing it up. And so more and more companies are seeing it as something that they need to address, which again is good.
Is it about modelling good behaviour?
I would say so, yes. I think there are brands that you'll think, I'll trust them, or ones that you won't. Again, how that translates into action may be a different question, but I think at least there is that recognition that we need to do something about it. I think it's almost like, not to draw too many parallels, but if you think about sustainability and kind of a lot of the proclamations about sustainability of products, you are expected to make a statement about the sustainability of your company. I think now there is more recognition. You need to say something about responsible AI too. I think right now, we may be kind of riding the high, okay, everyone wants to be responsible. They may not be there yet, but at least the intention is out there, and we're talking about it. And we're empowering people who are using and consuming these products and being affected by these decisions day to day to recognize, well, it does affect me too. I think as long as there is that social pressure slowly building, it will be part of the main conversation as well.
I was going to add that for the longest of time, the processes in tech were processes that were like 2-year long. From the time you started developing a technology, but to the time it reached the market, it was like 2 years of it's called a waterfall approach. So you're thinking about every stage in sequence and stuff. And then we transitioned to a version which I like a lot, which is the agile approach, where you're trying to do things quickly, incrementally, and get it in the real world as quick as you can. It's quite nice from the perspective of people who are developing, because I remember a friend who was working at Facebook at the time, and he told me he left Microsoft for Facebook because Microsoft was still adopting waterfall. Facebook was already adopting agile, and he told me, like, when I developed something at Microsoft, it took 2 years for that to get released. And then in the first day at Facebook, they gave me a set of tasks. I didn't know how to do any of them. I chose one, I looked it up, I did it, and next day when I come back to the company, they had a tracker to see how many people had used that functionality. And then when he checked, like 1 million people had used that functionality. And he was like, this is my first day, and I could have gotten fired in the first day if I had screwed up in the first, right at the start. But the idea is that we lost a bit of that track, that like when we were doing things 2 years into the future, we were thinking about where this is going. And we went to a rationality that it was like a mindset that it was like, it doesn't matter what I'm doing as long as it's getting to the market as fast as it can. And then by the time you learn the issues with it, it's the idea of moving fast and breaking things, right? Things are broken. So it becomes a bit challenging in that sense. I think we need to find a compromise where, at least that's what I try to do in my projects, was like, we are agile, but we are thinking ahead of time to see this is gonna down the road be an issue. So if I release it in this version, 3 versions into the future, I have to roll back and remove this because I have a lot of trouble in my hand. That's why the AI Act is trying to propose something which is, they call sandboxes. So when you deploy something, you're not immediately liable for it. There's a period of time in which you can test your system to see if anything happens differently than you expected, and then you can kind of roll back. But then comes the technical challenges, which is like, how do you do that in practice? So I think this is the trade-off we're trying to achieve. We don't have to wait for 2 years for a solution to get deployed, but you should not deploy the solution in the perspective like, there's a perspective in tech that is, it's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. So this perspective is not very conducive of a responsible approach. And I love the community that says that. It's a great community. I just don't like, they use it in a very specific context. If you take it to another context, it becomes a problem.
Okay, this is my last question before I open it up to the audience. There's significant effort to build public trust in AI and data, but should we be identifying clear boundaries where AI should not be used? Would it be more ethical to empower individuals and communities to reject AI in certain systems rather than trying to make AI universally acceptable?
Yes, it would be a short answer. I think it's really funny, and again, going back to the generative AI boom and what we're seeing, like I say, the number of things I've seen it used for work, it does not save time. It's just there because it can be there. And
it's shiny.
It's shiny and it's cool, and it's probably a lower risk way of trying it out. But I think we do need to think about the training of those models, the constant energy consumption, the water consumption that is required to actually run them. If it's really genuinely not needed, should it even be there? But I think equally, and even though I do work in tech, I get frustrated sometimes when suddenly people have disappeared. All I've got is tech to face off to. And I think we are at this stage where obviously it's cheaper to run the tech, probably, even if it breaks, we can fix it quicker. We're seeing massive layoffs, kind of basically premised on the promise of AI, not necessarily having delivered the outcomes that are wanted. So I think it's a broader discussion that we need to have as a society around where do we want to head forward. And I'm not sure we've figured it out yet.
I can give you an example of how this could be interesting, right? An opportunity. Let's say you're applying for a job, and then the job application asks you to write this and write that and write that. And each of these answers is like 4,000 characters or 400 words and stuff. And then you come with generative AI and you ask generative AI to write it for you. And you think that's an improvement. But the truth is, if you're asking generative AI to write it, it's because you have a feeling that nobody's going to be reading on the other end. Because you don't really care about the quality of what's being written. It's just that something has to fill that blank. So the process is wrong in that there's no way that there's somebody on the other end reading all these. But then in this end, you're trying to overcome that requirement that shouldn't be there, but it is there. And then you use generative AI to bypass this. So it feels like when I was in the university as a student, and I had a friend who actually wrote like a cake recipe in the middle of an essay, because he knew his teacher had so many students to be assessing that there was no way he could read everything. And when he came back and his grade was like an A, he was like, see, he doesn't read it. So it was like you have a process that is not scalable, and people now are going to start working that system. So the issue is how the requirements was set in the beginning. So I would never, let's say, trust a student that comes to me and delivers our dissertation that the only thing that the student did was come to ChatGPT and ask to write it for him or for her. Because that student doesn't show me any kind of creative, critical thinking capabilities. They're just delivering something that was completely made up. But at the same time, I cannot get to that student and say, look, you write, let's say, 400 pages into a thesis, like I had to do for my thesis, and it became like barbecue co or something like that, because nobody's ever going to be able to read the 400 pages. So we have to think about where our processes need to be improved, and generative AI is not the fix. The fix is to fix the process. It's just an opportunity for us to look at that and say, well, if you're needing generative AI for that, are you sure that the generative AI is the solution or the requirement is the issue?
Just another, this is the very last question from me. Just a follow-on question really about how do you empower individuals to reject AI in certain systems? I mean, that is, you know, from a community point of view and an individual point of view.
I think since we have the idea that in data privacy regulations, a user is allowed to opt out of their data being collected or stuff, you need to have something similar in terms of AI, in terms of like, it doesn't mean that it's not gonna happen. Like when I went to the bank and I applied for a mortgage and they denied it, the only answer they gave me was like, it was a qualitative analysis. There was no AI involved. It was like 10 years ago. They didn't care to explain. It just said, we did a qualitative analysis and you're declined. So that already happened before AI. But when you introduce AI, you also introduce many times a black box. And I think this is where the AI Act is trying to help into saying, even if it's not high risk, transparency is something that we need. And black boxing things is sometimes convenient when you don't want to have to give an answer, you just want to have an answer. But for society, I think black boxing things is a bad practice. So I think the transparency will have to be there. And if I want to say, like, I don't care if it's AI or not, but I want transparency, and your AI algorithm cannot give me the transparency, then I should be allowed to say, sorry, but then the issue is transparency, not AI.
I agree. I think from individual point of view, I guess there's two things. One, I don't want my data to be used. Opting out of things is really time consuming, difficult. It's not made obvious that you're being opted in sometimes. So even kind of tracking where your data is going is very, very difficult, which is why I think they're raising awareness and then putting pressure for better regulation is definitely a nicer way to ensure that, okay, now companies have to do that. They have to tell you, they have to make sure that that information lands right in front of you and that you are able to contest that or you're able to understand how the decision was made. So I really, really like the transparency provisions in the Act because I think we absolutely need them.
Thank you very much. So, have we got any questions? Ian, one of our alumni.
Hello. Yeah, many thanks for a very interesting presentation discussion there. I am involved with a third sector organisation. I was at an event today which was data and digital centric. AI came up a lot. We were considering with some trepidation the idea of generative AI to answer generic questions in a public-facing context. Is this the sort of thing we should be nervous about? I would caveat that by saying it would be generic questions to widen reach and to triage things to allow more specific questions to be answered by a human. But do you think that's the sort of thing we should be nervous about or enthusiastic about? Because I wake up every different day with a different feeling in my head, to be honest, after seeing what goes on.
What I can say is that the level of risk is proportional to how open-ended the AI system is. So if you take an AI system and you let it answer any given question, the level of risk is much higher than if you say you have an AI system that is specifically trained on your context and it's going to be providing answers to your context. So there's the proportionality between, the correlation between the level of risk and the scope of the AI system.
Yeah, and I would say that what you're feeling is very much what I feel every time I think about the use of AI. I absolutely agree with what you said, Leonardo, just around the limiting of the context, because we have seen, I think, chatbots going rogue. It's very easy to game them if their guardrails are not in place. So yeah, I would think carefully about what you're trying to use it for and how to put the right constraints in place so that the users, particularly, again, depending on the third sector organization, but I imagine there may be like exposure to, for example, vulnerable people who may be seeking information. How do you handle that and make sure that they're not facing off to a computer when they're already in a very vulnerable situation and that may not get passed on to a human agent? So there's a lot to think about, but happy to pick up with you separately as well.
So the mic's for people at home.
Hi, it's Michael Jakubiak from Andy Axon. We're developing a diagnostic technology. I just want to ask your opinion. So with diagnostics currently, what the AIs do is detecting many more diseases and conditions than a doctor itself is able to diagnose. So the tool which improves efficiency and productivity from the other side cause new challenges because detects many more conditions to treat. So is it ethical or not?
It reminds me of when people first started using lenses in microscopes. I don't know if you know that story, but when my teacher first taught me this one, it's like people didn't want to buy the meat anymore because they were looking through the lenses and there were these things crawling in the meat, right? So it's not the things that were crawling in the meat were always there, but because now we had powerful lenses, we could see them. So I know that one concern you need to have is like it's like I have relatives that they will look up, I'm sneezing, and then they look up in Google and the answer is like, you might have cancer. So for these kind of people, it's probably a better idea that they don't have this overly aggravated perception of conditions that maybe everybody has, but because they have this tendency of overly worrying about this, giving them a huge list instead of the prioritized things would matter. I think that's what GPs do most of the times. They look at you and you give a set of symptoms. They might think about very serious diseases, but they try to prioritize from the simple explanations before, because if they first tell you it might be cancer, a doctor did that to me. He said, you probably had a heart attack. And I'm like, wait, what? And then he tested me. He said, no, you had nothing. He said, yeah, but in the 2 weeks before, between when you told me I might have had a heart attack and you actually told me I didn't have a heart attack, it didn't feel very well, right? It didn't feel very good. So I think what I can say is this, but it's a very open-ended scenario.
I think I would expand on the medical analogy in that, in Poland, access to blood tests, for example, it's quite cheap to get your bloods done privately. You don't need a referral. You can do panels upon panels. My parents love blood tests. They do blood tests every month. They keep the charts of their vitamin D, everything. And because of that, they're in constant fear that the next test will show something. So they will keep on kind of looking and getting exposed to, and even if the norm is like 0.1 of whatever off versus what they've got, they'll look for those symptoms, self-diagnose, think they've got all these diseases. And I think this is where the role of a doctor comes in. Like say, the doctor wouldn't tell you that, oh, well, this could be meaning that, but rather they draw on their expertise. And I think this is where, in any scenario, it's the human working together with the AI that will bring that improved result, because AI will be detecting things better, but the doctor will be able to apply their judgment and better understanding of the subject matter as well to actually facilitate better outcomes.
One follow-up to this. Realistically, what actually happens, that I think what's going to happen, that we won't have normal professions, we will have AI operators in that case, train for the certain things. So AI operator for the law, AI operator for the medicines, AI operator for accountancy, and so on. What do you think?
That with computer operators. It became computer systems everywhere, and we are in a sense computer operators. But we didn't lose our role in this. What worries me more is when we're delegating the decision making, and now you don't have the power. But that happens not only with AI, it happens all throughout. Like, I was invited to a board recently, and the reason why I didn't say yes was because I knew I wouldn't have the power to make a decision, but my name would be as a part of the board, so I'm kind of like signing off in the decisions whether I agree or not with those decisions. So that's what I worry more about, that the decisions are made and you're listed as the operator, but it was actually not you who was making the call.
I would say that technology in and of itself won't do that. It will only happen if we allow it to happen. No one will remove humans from these processes. It may be that we'll improve AI in different domains so that we'll become literally just the consumers of what it says and ultimately signing off on the decisions. But I think when we frame these questions around AI taking over the world, we forget that we hold the power to stop it, because it's us who make the decision, okay, that now AI will be making the judgment about whether you get a mortgage or not. Well, that is the challenge, yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, what you mentioned on the layoffs, it's not the AI that is laying people off in tech, it's managers. Because they think this is a way to be more effective, like save on the cost effectiveness of things. So it's a person making that decision. The AI in this case is but a tool that is being used by a person to do that. But I think that when I first visited some parts of the UK, like I was in Manchester, in some places that made me look back into the Industrial Revolution days. And I go to museums and I see about this stuff, I think, so there was a time when a child was allowed to work from 6 in the morning to 10 in the evening in a factory. And today this is not allowed anymore. So I think we just have to be mindful where society is going in a trend that is positive or negative. But we should, like, if we're doing enough, I hope we're going in a positive trend rather than a negative one.
It's easy to kind of think, well, the we is the democratic society we. I often kind of fall into despair because I think, well, ultimately it's not us, because it's a few big tech companies that make these decisions. But again, it's our role to put the pressure on the governments to introduce those boundaries and those regulations and make sure that we move in the right direction. It's hard because we've got so much to do and it's complicated and we're not listened to, but I think the only thing we can do is try.
But I'll give an example of like the actress that just won the Oscars 2 days ago. She was saying, I don't have a social media account. And I was like, yes, it's not just me. But when she says that, it has much more power than when I say that. Because then I'm just like this paranoid guy. And she's winning an Oscar and then she's saying, well, for my mental health, I wouldn't be able to cope with it. So it helps in the sense that like a company will have to respond to the fact that it's losing a significant number of active users monthly because they're feeling that this is an environment where their mental health is not improving, is actually worsening. A company will have to answer to that because those number of monthly active users will have a reflection in terms of the investment that they're able to get and their profit margins and stuff. So they will have to react. It's like if you were eating rotten food and people were dying, there are less people to buy the food. So a supermarket or whoever produces the food will have to do something different because the customers have to live on so they can keep buying more. So there's always a way of pushing back a society. The difficulty is just to do it collectively, right? The challenge.
Have we got time for one last question? One last question?
You choose.
Oh, no. Yeah.
So I was thinking, I think you've kind of touched on this point I'm going to make with what you were saying, like, but I was thinking about the example with the reporting on the performance review and what is good behavior in that context. So my question was, how much of the conversation on responsible AI or the frameworks around it involve examining the incentive structures around that, or because like good behavior in a certain context with certain incentive structures can be like different from if you try to change these and be aware of like what the structures are, then it's kind of like I guess you're addressing the problem in a bit more of a systemic way. Does this make sense?
Absolutely, it does. And so definitely I see the cultural side of things as integral when we think about responsible AI and introducing it to the organization. I think the limitation sometimes may be that obviously we're at the mercy of our clients to convince them that it's the right thing to do and then ultimately kind of help shape the project in a way that will allow us to do it. I think touching on culture is a bit like touching on ethics. People get very defensive and say, well, we've got great company culture. They may not know that their direct reports are terrified of speaking to them about any problems because they haven't taken time to examine that. What we try to do is just show with examples of behaviors and incentives that actually, you may not want to be continuing in that way. So how about we speak to a few people, look at a workshop, just try and figure out what kind of behaviors are being incentivized, look at the formal incentive structure as well, and then see if there's any improvements that need to be made. It is a tough conversation, I would say, and I would say the majority of projects kind of delay the culture conversation, even though I would almost start from that, because that can really tell you kind of where you need to look for the culprit.
I mean, it's challenging a power structure within the organization, so I guess it's hard to address.
But for me, the challenge is not that it's difficult to convince people on top about the change. For me, it's difficult to convince people in our level about change, because doing the right thing and pushing the right agenda is very challenging. Like I lost track of how many times I had this physical or emotional exhaustion because you have a situation where you know what's the right thing to do, but doing that is very challenging. You're coming against maybe a boss, maybe a family relative, people that you have to come up to and say, that is not the right thing to do. And that is very, very difficult to do. So I think we need to have a culture where, let's say, if you're in the public transportation and somebody is doing something that is wrong, it doesn't feel that difficult to stand up and say, well, that is wrong. Because right now it does. That's why you have, like, we live in a culture where whoever screams the loudest sounds like it's the person with the reason in the room, right? It's difficult to get somebody to stand up to that person. And this is not just in a specific country. This is basically what we're seeing very, very, from a general perspective. Like, the loudest the person is and the most noise the person makes, it's kind of like everybody else doesn't feel confident or strong enough to stand up to that. And this is the kind of, let's say, perspective and worldview that we need to have if we want the world to be a better place. I think I only do some of the things that I do because I have 2 kids. And then I think like, I don't know if I would do it for myself, but I mean, 20 years from now, they need to have a better place to live in. So that helps me, but it's exhausting.
Thank you. One last question.
I think this goes off the previous question you just answered. So I did my master's in data and AI ethics here, and I focused on moral disengagement with software engineers. And so going off of this question about the attitudes of the workers building these softwares, one of the potential solutions to that I explored was codification of ethics within organizations. The challenge I was coming up against was, academically speaking and also professionally, like the practical output of such a thing. It's hard to sort of rally up workers to be mindful of the moral consequences of what they're doing, because either they don't have the agency to make the necessary changes, or management sort of suppresses that. I wondered what your attitudes to such a thing would be, and any reactions possibly that could come from that.
So again, I think it goes back to changing as a company as a whole. So you won't be able to empower the software developers if their managers equally don't recognize the importance. And likewise, if the software developers don't feel like they have the agency, then like you say, well, why would they even engage with it if they ultimately don't feel like they can make a difference? So I would bring that back to that cultural discussion. And I know that culture, again, similarly to ethics, it can sound almost like fluffy sometimes. So what do you actually do? Well, it's you get these people in the room, first separate groups to let them speak freely, understand their issues separately, but then actually trying to diagnose a problem, bring them together and think about, okay, if we did that, would that help? How would we feel if we did a certain thing? And I think, in kind of early days of my ethics career, one of the projects I worked on was with a police force where they were really intent on using all the data that they've got to predict whether someone's going to leave the force. They wanted to basically be able to pinpoint, okay, this person, say John, will leave in 20 months, and we're 80% sure of that. And while they framed the issue as, okay, we have too many people leaving, costs too much to onboard new people, want to do something about it. The immediate reaction from me was, you could just look at that and say, okay, well, if John's going to leave, I'm not going to give him pay rise. I'm not going to bother. I don't like John anyway. So we were trying to moderate some of the discussions around, okay, who should be making decisions about how this data is used, who gets to see it, how it's being actioned, and then actually only through surfacing some of the scenarios and how things could go wrong and where individuals or collective groups could be on the line when we give insights to people that they shouldn't have. It's only then, kind of through spelling out the consequences, that we're able to drive the discussion at, okay, maybe we just need kind of a very high-level trend to understand that a specific group is more likely to leave, and we need to do something about it. But even then, if you discovered that they're leaving because of pay and you don't have any more money, there's kind of limited, I guess, willingness to engage with what you're doing, because ultimately you feel like, okay, well, I can't change anything, so why would I do that? Which goes back to bringing people together and talking about it. I'm afraid that's the hard way that we need to go through.
It also involves how we design our curriculum, because right now we have silos in society where one group of people will learn the technology, another group of people will learn about the harms, and they cannot connect because they're in different silos. So I've been in tech for very long, and I remember in various situations that were very obvious to me that there was a harm involved, and nobody else could see it just because we had a bit of a different background. But at the same time, the people that I knew were people that wanted to do the right thing. They needed the protocols and the processes to do so. And one of the jokes is I was at Toyota giving this talk to a group of developers, and one of them looked at my presentation and it had some colors. And I had a bottle, it had some colors, and he says, is it a coincidence between what you have there in the slides and your bottle? I said, no, it's a protocol, it's called the rainbow. So it's kind of like, as long as you have a protocol, you just follow it and it's going to work. So they wanted protocols and guidelines to be able to tick the boxes from the perspective of like, at least I know where I'm going here. And it's not their fault when they cannot envision something that they haven't studied or haven't prepared for. So it's bridging those gaps.
I think that's why that governance point is so important, because that takes away the responsibility from an individual. It's just what we do now, that you have to look at these questions and at these consequences, and you don't get penalized for it because that is just what happens. And I think it's important. Like, it's great if individuals bring these problems. We want the individuals to be engaged, but I think it's so much better when they have a structure where they can actually raise them.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for some really interesting questions. That's been a great conversation. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you very much, Leonardo. It's lovely to meet you both. So, time to draw today's event to an end. I don't know whether you're aware, but the Data Lab is hosting DataFest coming up soon. Get your tickets now. 12th to the 13th of May. It's the place to be if you're a data person. Could you also give us some feedback? Let us know how we've done today so that we can improve things, change the flavour of the pizza, etc. And thank you all so much for a really engaging, informative, stimulating debate. Thank you. Good night. Thank you so much. It's fascinating.